So welcome to this awesome panel that we've assembled on perspectives on climate risk in natural human systems. Um, so the way this is going to work is I'm going to introduce the panelists initially, and then we'll have opening remarks from each of our panelists. And then we'll move into a curated question and answer session. And then we'll open it up to the audience that's here as well as our virtual audience. So especially for this topic, I think this is one of the best panels we could have assembled at NC State. No pressure to the panelists. So let me introduce our three panelists. So first we have Dr. Kathie Dello. So Kathie is a state climatologist of North Carolina and the director of the North Carolina State Climate Office. She's the fifth permanent director and the first woman to hold this position at the NCSCO in the office's history. Kathie is involved with climate resilience planning and impact assessment and works with multiple climate agencies across the nation. She especially works closely with North Carolina state agencies to help them understand their climate risks. She also has a great Twitter presence. So if you're there, I highly recommend following her for the latest climate science updates. Our next panelist is Dr. Fernando Garcia Menendez. He's an assistant professor in the Civil Construction and Environmental Engineering Department. Fernando uses computational modeling and data analysis to explore interdisciplinary questions related to air pollution, climate change, and environmental policy. His research group's work focuses on developing tools to simulate interactions between environmental and human systems. In 2021, Fernando received the George Blesses Advising Award, which recognizes faculty members who consistently and willingly give their time and effort to advising, counseling, and mentoring students and assisting student groups. Our third panelist is Dr. Jordan Kern, who is an assistant professor in the College of Natural Resources. His group studies the dynamic natural human systems in order to improve our understanding of new risks to people and the environment, focusing on the water-energy nexus. His work also focuses on developing novel approaches for mitigating climate vulnerabilities. He recently won an NSF Career Award for the project Navigating the Two-Front Challenge for the Power Grid, Extreme Weather, and the Race to Decarbonization. For those in the energy field, for those not in the energy field, I also refer you to a great YouTube playlist he has of his Energy Systems 300 course. I often refer to these videos myself when I need a quick refresher on things. And if you're not an energy person and just want to learn basics of how a power grid operates, I encourage you to check out Jordan's playlist. So let's get started with our opening remarks. And Kathie, why don't we get started with you first?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody in person, online. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for the really kind invitation. I'm not using slides. It's been a long semester. One thing had to go, and slides were it for this talk. But yeah, I can discuss a little bit about my past and what I do. Most people don't know we have a state climatologist and are always surprised and ask if it gets me any perks at restaurants and whatnot. But essentially, I work with all 10.5 million North Carolinians, and that is through public health, transportation, agriculture, really, you name it, because climate and weather touches everything, everybody. And I got into this field truly because I love weather. I wanted to be a meteorologist, and I fell into a global crisis. So I pivoted toward working in climate and climate resilience. And I've been doing that across 3 states for most of my career. Certainly thinking about mitigation, and I'm glad that so many folks are working on it, but really my bread and butter is the today through the next 30 years. How do we keep people safe? How do we move people out of harm's way? And how, when we move them, do we not move them into more harm's way? So where do you go to flee climate change? And last summer, a reporter called me up and said, you know, Kathie, it's 116 degrees in Portland, Oregon. All these other things are happening across the country. Where do you go to flee climate change? I said, you basically can't. So we have our 2-pronged approach, obviously reducing our heat trapping gases. And we learned earlier last week that time is running out to do that. A pretty dire report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But also, how do we build a thriving North Carolina? So I was involved with 2 efforts right when I got here in 2019 to assess North Carolina's climate asking them the question, what keeps you up at night in regards to your system with a changing climate? So some examples of that are the Department of Transportation needs to build a new bridge on 95 in Lumberton, and they realize they have to raise it because of flooding. But you can't just raise a bridge arbitrarily. It's very expensive, costs a lot of money, and they want to be good stewards of financial resources. So how high do they have to raise it so that this bridge lasts 100 years, that people stay safe so that you're not driving over a flooded road, and also so it doesn't cost $1 trillion? Or we'll talk with public health officials. I work a lot in extreme heat. So this is a big public health risk, especially for outdoor workers who are often migrants or powerless in their positions and exposed to really dangerous conditions when they're working outside. We know we have air conditioning in North Carolina in a lot of places, but not everybody can afford it. Not everybody will turn it on because they think it'll cool down overnight. We know our overnight temperatures are warming. And not everybody has it either. So thinking about some of these equity issues is where I've really pivoted my work. Climate change is hitting the most vulnerable first, and hardest. And we know that resource communities like Charleston are moving a hospital and building a flood wall. So there are a number of communities in the Carolinas that need a lot more assistance. So that's basically where I focus my work. Pretty much whatever hazard you want. These days it's flooding and heat, but I've done a lot of work in drought as well. And my day doesn't look the same from day to day. Truly, it's things like this. I give seminars, I give a lot of public talks about climate change. I meet with all sorts of officials, policymakers, students, you name it. So that's the fun part of my job. And I will wrap it up there. I'm happy to take any questions in the Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks, Kathie. Fernando, do you want to give your opening statement? Sure. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, that might just work. Okay. All right. So I attempted not to use slides. I got phone back there. I thought I didn't know what was going to happen. No worries. All right. So my work, I'm an air pollution scientist, above all. So I study air quality, and that kind of led me to studying air quality in the context of climate change a number of years ago, and I've kind of gone further into studying climate change and different impacts now, looking at things beyond air quality as well. There's some connections to air quality. So I thought, what might be of interest is to show what may be unique in the work we do in the Research Matter Group does related to climate change. What I have here is just some images from the last US National Climate Assessment, and you can see there are projections of temperature under a couple of scenarios with different emission targets. So we have a high scenario, low scenario, at mid-century, end of century. And then this fourth National Climate Assessment really goes into detail looking at the impacts. So it will have impacts on things like communities, the economy, US quality and quantity of water, health, ecosystems, infrastructure, a number of different impacts. And these are, of course, overlapping. So there's different things that would fit into both of those categories. And so that's really what we do. We look at certain impacts and try to model them. We really try to understand what underlies those projections of impacts and how to get a better understanding, better characterization of those climate impacts. And so from climate assessments, this is just one example. There have been many different climate assessments published or put out. You could get these types of statements. I'll focus here on two areas that are more familiar to our research, health and specifically climate change impacts on air quality, and ecosystems, specifically, for example, climate change impacts on wildfire in the US. You can get these types of projections where we say, the projections will show negative impacts on things like air quality and things like fire, and then projections even of a number of deaths avoided due to decreases or changes in air quality under different mitigation scenarios, an increase in burn area from wildfires in the US by a certain factor under different scenarios, comparing scenarios with or without mitigation. This is, for example, the fourth Natural Climate Assessments chapter on air quality. You can see there, climate change will worsen, or the projection is that it will worsen air pollution levels in the US, increase things like respiratory disease or cardiovascular disease, and even premature mortality in the US. And what we do is try to look at take a big or kind of an in-depth view of some of these projections and some of these impacts in the face of things like uncertainty in the projections. When we talk about air quality specifically, which is what we've looked at most, these projections of impacts are coming from these coupled mechanisms between climate and air quality. So climate, of course, can affect things like atmospheric chemistry by affecting temperature or affect ventilation, and that's going to lead to differences in concentrations or emissions, different deposition rates. So many different interconnected mechanisms ultimately lead to what is known as, or what we often call in the air quality field, the climate penalty on air quality, for example. And so we've done similar projections ourselves going back a number of years where we compare scenarios with mitigation to scenarios with no climate change mitigation efforts, look at those mechanisms with atmospheric chemistry and climate models, and try to quantify those impacts on things like air quality and the associated health impacts. We did that. We've done that, as I said, for a number of different impacts, for a number of different outcomes of climate change, and then we can see, or we can try to project. The plot on the right there has changes in climate-induced changes in particulate matter pollution. So that's fine particles in the atmosphere, which will have the largest impact on human health. And then translate that into things like a number of premature deaths that would be avoided by a stringent versus no climate policy scenarios. So things like number of premature deaths in the year 2050 at mid-century, even at the end of the century. And then we, those types of numbers are what people perhaps at EPA would like to report, right? So we've seen those, our numbers cited by EPA administrators or different folks. And it really comes down to reporting a projected number of deaths avoided by climate change mitigation efforts at mid-century or even beyond that, or a projected number of increased deaths associated with climate change. What we really try to do, though, is, and this can be done for a number of sectors. So this is an example of a EPA study from a number of years ago, which cited these numbers. So here's the air quality deaths again, 57,000 fewer deaths in 2100. But similar things for extreme heat, or water quality, or economic costs associated with things like infrastructure and electricity in 2100. The thing we tried to do differently is really dig into uncertainty and kind of better inform projections of air quality that go beyond just those simple numbers. And the work we do, we go from socioeconomic scenarios to climate projections to things like impacts on atmospheric chemistry and air quality, and really try to capture all that cascading uncertainty and provide more informative estimates of these impacts. Let me just finish up by showing you, for example, if we account for natural variability in our projections, these are the same projections that led to those numbers that were reported by the EPA administrator as far as avoided deaths under climate change mitigation. Those, in this case, this is for ozone specifically, so one pollutant. And the large map on the right, that's the ensemble mean projection. So that's what's underlying those numbers that the EPA administrator reported and that appeared on CNN and that are included in that report. But what all the smaller maps indicate kind of just variations in those projections that would be possible just due to natural variability. So even not forced by greenhouse gas emissions, just due to the natural variability and the unpredictable nature, the chaotic nature of the climate system. Those are all different possibilities, equally likely to occur in the year 2100. We can have, a year or impacts in we can have kind of an impact in 2100 where the entire country may be experiencing a significant penalty on ozone pollution, a significantly climate-induced increase in ozone pollution, or we could have another scenario where in the year 2100 specifically, most of the countries actually experiencing a climate-induced decrease in air quality. This is just one example of kind of the underlying variability and the underlying uncertainty in these projections, and that's really what we're trying to capture in our research and I like to present sometimes this is a tool that's developed, kind of a communication tool that's developed by the research group I used to work for before coming to NC State at MIT, known as the Climate Wheels, and it kind of shows a better way of thinking about these impacts, right? And climate change as well as climate change impacts. You know, have to think about it as a distribution of probabilities associated with different impacts. And so here, for example, there's two kind of wheels. The one on the left are the potential outcomes that you could get under no policy scenario. So it's very likely that you get an increase in global mean temperature above 40 degrees C under that no policy scenario. But there's still kind of a smaller chance that it would be somewhere between 3 and 4, and even a very small chance that it would be below 3 degrees increase in global temperature. If we do a mitigation scenario, if we implement climate policy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then you get the other wheel on the right, which will make it much more likely that you stay perhaps below 3 degrees C increase in global mean temperature, but there's still a possibility that you'll go beyond that temperature increase into the 3 to 4 range, or a possibility that you'll go even lower than 2 degrees, right? So it's a better way of thinking about these impacts, trying to build distributions and look at the uncertainties and the whole distribution of these potential outcomes. I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thanks, Fernando. Jordan, do you want to give your opening remarks?
Sure. I'm Jordan Kern. I'm an assistant professor here at NC State in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources. My background is in what I would describe as like environmental systems engineering. And at this point, my group is very focused on the electric power sector. We did a little bit of work with alternative transportation fuels, but mostly focused on the grid. And usually what I describe our group's focus as is sort of two-pronged. The first is that we build software to study the grid, usually, and when you think about it being a dynamic system that responds to extreme events that are, or forcings that are uncertain, a system that we would like to engineer differently to be less carbon intensive, more resilient in the face of extreme events, et cetera. It's really helpful to have a model. And there are lots of different commercial softwares that exist for how to study any particular given part of the US grid. But those are really expensive. They cost like hundreds of thousands of dollars to license. And so what my group does is build free open source versions of those same types of models. And we are funded to do that so that other researchers can use that software to simulate the behavior of any system within the US grid that they're interested in. And often what that means for us is that we have to balance multiple objectives when you're designing the software. You want models that are accurate, that are able to replicate what you've seen the grid do in the past, but they also have to be fast, because if you want to study the vulnerability of the grid to something like climate change, where there is tremendous uncertainty, right? And even within a given climate state, there's a lot of interannual variability. And the design features of systems often are set to, withstand some sort of rare event, a risk that's like 1 in 50 or 1 in 100, or if you're really conservative, beyond that. So you have to stress test the grid or models of the grid with hundreds or thousands of years of data, right? Weather data or future climate scenarios. And then if you think about the fact that the grid itself is going to evolve and use different technologies in the future, you get all of these combinatorial uncertainties that could lead to different outcomes. And they might all be equally probable, right? Or the different states of the world. And so we have to build models that are accurate and fast, and that itself is kind of a challenge. So the second part of what my group does is we use these models to understand in a really detailed way how the grid reacts to the events. So that could be drought, heat waves, sustain the losses of like wind speed that might reduce wind power production, flooding, all of this in combination. And so there's different vulnerabilities that we think of when we are using our models to stress test the grid. The first would be physical vulnerabilities where actual damage is being done to the grid, like flooding at substations, et cetera. And then there's sort of another perspective that's equally important, which is more economic, right? So in many parts of the US, the electrical grid is actually administered by independent parties, and electricity itself is treated as a commodity that can be bought and sold, not by individual consumers per se, but by big utilities. And just like any market, the price for that commodity goes up and down, subject to the laws of supply and demand. And so what those laws are really subject to is weather, right? That's what really drives supply and demand for electricity in the modern grid. On the demand side, daily changes in electricity demand, year-to-year changes in peak demand, which is essentially the high water mark that utilities and system operators have to plan around and figure out how much stuff they want to build, is driven almost entirely by air temperatures in combination with wind speeds. So really, really hot, really, really cold increases demand for electricity. And now increasingly, as we decarbonize, one of the main options that we're looking at is using forms of energy that are inherently dependent on meteorology, wind speeds, and solar panels. So now you have both supply and demand essentially fluctuating due to weather. And so a big part of what we do is to try to figure out, for a given system, the likelihood that, number one, you're going to run out of electricity and experience a blackout, but also for individual firms that are participating in that market, how much electricity they could expect to sell and at what price they could expect to sell it. And that by itself begins to inform directly the types of investments they may or may not be willing to make in the future. So we've got this is sort of pan-US at this point. We've done a lot of work on the West Coast. The Western United States, tends to be more vulnerable to things like drought, just because they depend more on water for electricity production. But other parts of the country, Texas, the Northeast are vulnerable to extreme cold. Also heat waves. We do a lot of work looking at the impacts of flooding in North Carolina. We're increasingly interested in what happens to emissions from power plants and how those track with human exposure to different sources of air pollution. And yeah, it's been pretty fun, and got a lot of interesting work going on, and happy to take questions in the Q&A.
Awesome. Well, thank you to all three of our panelists for their opening statements. You answered many of the questions I had, so I'm a little. But let's start with you, Kathie. So, what are some of the climate risks that North Carolina faces? And you worked in Oregon for a lot of years. You worked in North Carolina. What are the differences you saw in the two states with your work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in North Carolina, flooding is a risk statewide, so not just on the coast. Obviously, we have low-lying areas on the coast that are very vulnerable to sea level rise and other types of flooding. But we're seeing an increase in those 3, 4, 5-inch events that we get. Your phone will go off. You'll get a flash flood warning. You shouldn't go to Crabtree Mall because they should not have built that mall there. But also, we're just seeing so many more days like that. And then up in the mountains last year, Tropical Storm Fred passed through. 20 years ago, that would have been a rain event, and it caused historic catastrophic flooding in Canton, North Carolina, and 6 people died. So flooding across the state heat, especially overnight. Those overnight temperatures are screaming hot. You know, I don't know if you can call 75 screaming hot, but a lot warmer than they used to be. We do have some drought issues here. Our drought issues tend to be a little bit flashier than the West, where we will go through periods of like 3 or 4 months and farmers will start to get worried, and then we'll get one of those big rainfall events. So it's really tough to manage a crop if you're either worried about your field being flooded and getting your crop in, or your crop not having enough water. And then back in Oregon, it was drought. So a lot of what Jordan said, wildfire. I got out before the bad fire happened 2 years ago, but many smoky summers in Oregon. And honestly, heat was not on my radar until last year in Oregon. And I saw the computer models had 120 degrees Fahrenheit as the forecasted temperature. And I thought, absolutely not. Physically impossible, like maybe 108. And I got to 116 in Portland. So a few folks made a comment when I left Oregon for North Carolina that I was running toward climate change. I think I got out. So, yeah. But both states have very similar issues and similar values. People love Oregon, people love North Carolina, want to protect the natural beauty of it. So it's easy to talk about climate impacts in that way because you can talk about shared values and why you want to protect the state that you love.
Gotcha. Thanks. Let me shift focus. So Jordan, I had a question for you based on something you said. When we think of the risks, climate risk poses to power grid operation, like your mind goes to events like Texas or the heat wave in California, but there's also just having that uncertainty with climate that affects day-to-day grid operation, that system operators, like you mentioned, demand forecasting or even like derating of thermal power plants. So could you flesh out some of those challenges? Like just besides like the grid needs to deal with extreme weather events, there's like operational challenges that climate risk poses to the traditional way we've operated the power grid.
Yeah, so I think that I would make the distinction between climate risk, which I generally associate with longer term changes, and weather forecasting, which is when you say day-to-day, week-out operation of the grid, it's really weather forecasting. And there are parts of that that are easier to do than others, right? So Duke Energy knows with a high degree of precision, 3 to 4% error, what demand for electricity is going to be tomorrow, because they have an entire history of how much electricity we've used for a given day of the week and a given air temperature outside, et cetera. What's more difficult to forecast day ahead, certainly beyond that, would be like wind speeds for wind power production. Cloud effects are tricky. At least you know like what periods of the day you definitely won't have solar power, and that makes things a little bit easier. But I think the use of meteorological forecasting at utilities is growing, especially in the areas of trying to predict variable renewable energy production. Now, they're always going to be wrong, right? And so the backup plan, and the same backup plan it's always been, is to have types of power plants that are responsive and flexible. And sometimes that means that they are more expensive, right? And that could be a natural gas power plant that's a combustion turbine that is really quick, but is essentially like a jet engine and is going to, be costly and produce a lot of emissions. Or in the future, it could be, something like batteries. Out west, it often is hydropower, but that means you have to have water. So I think that that tends to be the solution right now, is using infrastructure, flexible infrastructure, as a response to dealing with uncertainty and changes.
Gotcha. Thanks. Yeah, and the point of uncertainty, Fernando, like when I think of your research, like air quality and human health, like especially human health, like quantifying the damages that air pollution causes, like air pollution crosses state lines. It doesn't go through these sort of geographical boundaries that we've drawn. And I'm like, from my end, I'm very intimidated by air quality mode. Like when I see them, it's like, oh man, that's. So could you give a sense of like, what are the challenges that air quality models face? And how do you deal with this uncertainty, and how do you make these models robust to the uncertainties associated?
Sure.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Okay. So I would say in the context of climate change specifically, right? Because air quality models can be used, have been more so used just to forecast kind of shorter term air quality or do present day scenarios of air quality. But in the context of climate interactions or air quality under climate change, I would say uncertainty poses a challenge, and there's definitely value to trying to reduce uncertainty. Of course, when we look at something like air quality, which is going to directly impact public health, then just based on the value that we place on health and human life, it really becomes a huge fraction of climate impacts. Every one of those deaths, we place a very high value on them. So there's definitely value to designing your adaptation and mitigation plans with reduced uncertainty. But kind of the key there, I think, would be to, first of all, acknowledge that there is going to be uncertainty in those projections regardless. And trying to reduce it is good, but also being aware that there are irreducible uncertainties, and there will always be uncertainty that's important as you're kind of designing those strategies. When we're talking about climate specifically, climate uncertainties, people split them into 3 different types of uncertainties. There's uncertainties associated with our scenarios of emissions and policy. Those, as we kind of increase confidence in our policies and in our mitigation approaches and our trajectories, that uncertainty can be reduced. That hasn't happened to a large extent. There's still high uncertainty regarding how what scenario will actually occur and to what degree we'll be able to constrain emissions. All these projections, of course, are based on models, and so there's model uncertainty. The model uncertainty, that is maybe the clearest one to improve, right? So you can improve that with more sophisticated models, more realistic models, higher resolution models, more powerful models. And so that's been continuing, there's been work done. That's been continuous work for decades, trying to improve the models, and there's been substantial advances in the models themselves, becoming more realistic. And then there's what I mentioned in slides, there's things like just natural variability, which is an irreducible form of uncertainty. There's been advances in trying to capture that with high performance computing resources, getting better, and large ensembles, but that's ultimately an irreducible form of uncertainty. So kind of communicating that uncertainty and understanding that uncertainty, I think, is as important, at least, as looking for ways to reduce the. I think the focus has to be on making decisions that are well informed, given kind of a complete picture of impacts, and then working on when you look about the impacts. There's kind of course, I mentioned this would be related to what Jordan was saying. It's one thing to worry about uncertainty in the climate projection, but then there's other, for air quality, there's also uncertainty with our emissions of anthropogenic air pollutants, conventional air pollutants, and precursors. So that's uncertain. The way health is going to respond to those pollutants is uncertainty. So I think a lot of kind of the future work lies in characterizing those interactions with other things like human systems, health, economic impacts, and how those kind of get compounded as you include climate uncertainty. So, that's kind of the way I would say you should deal with it, getting the best, most complete picture possible, and then making decisions that are better informed with that full picture rather than simply trying to get a reduced uncertainty in all aspects.
Awesome. That makes sense. Great answer. All 3 of our panelists have done some really cool interdisciplinary collaborations. I know, Kathie, you work with a lot of agriculture experts in your work. Fernando, I know you work with power grid experts on like air pollution and power plant emissions. Could you, for our audience today, could you share some of your interdisciplinary collaborations and how important they are when it comes to assessing climate risks and their impacts?
Can I start?
Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I work with all sorts of experts. I often am the least necessary person in the room. And we work closely with, I'll go with agriculture because that's the one you brought up, North Carolina Extension, which has an office in all 100 counties and also a tribal office with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, so 101 offices. And we will work with them on weather, so the day-to-day, like Jordan said, but also climate. We will build tools for them to help them understand when they should be planting certain crops. We will work with them to understand how a crop may thrive in the future or not thrive in a changing climate. And also we work a lot on communication. So these people are really trusted individuals in their communities. You know, I'm Kathie from Raleigh. Somebody in Hope County is going to relate to somebody that they see in local restaurants and that they go to church with. So we will work with them to train them about climate impacts and climate risks. We'll learn a little bit more about what people are asking for on the ground and tailor some of our lessons toward that. But that's been a really successful model. I have 12 people in my office, which is a big state climate office, but there are so many places we need to get to. So that's one way we work with agriculture. And these people, it's a really savvy sector. They know weather, they know climate. They've been recording it for years. They've been very adaptable. So, you know, it's always very humbling to work with these folks. I always learn something when I walk away. And it's also one of these sectors where we can both adapt. So we can think about maybe growing things differently or growing different crops, although sweet potatoes are our #1 here in North Carolina. And we can also think about mitigation. So we can think about carbon sequestration and other methods such as using less fossil fuels in agriculture.
As far as working with interdisciplinary collaborators, I found that to be that kind of the only way to get anything worthwhile done when working on these types of topics, right? I don't think there's going to be, when you're looking at something like the climate impact, there's going to be one expert that can really understand, or maybe understand that would be an expert on all the kind of implications that go into it. So for the air quality work, I'm an air quality scientist, but I've always worked with people that have greater expertise in climate science. I work with people that have more expertise on air quality epidemiology and health impacts. And for other applications, things like forestry impacts, work with people who know about forestry, or people when we're looking at policy or mitigation options, work with people who know about policy. I think you can have, in my case, it's always been, I can have expertise on some of these things perhaps, but that really isn't going to allow me to build pictures. So kind of working as a team with a number of experts is often what's the only way to go about answering these questions.
Jonas?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. I like both Kathie and Fernando's. And it's been similar to my own. I think when you say interdisciplinary, I think like across academic disciplines, definitely I've had similar experiences. I'm not a climate expert or a weather expert. My tendency is to boil all of it down into something statistical, right? But I work closely with actual, climatologists before, and it's really helpful, hydrologists, et cetera. And also have had a lot of enjoyment and satisfaction working with actual stakeholders. And that's not always rewarded in academic research, but I think it's the only way to have kind of a societal impact. And the only other thing I would add is that I think that funding agencies are increasingly open to and encouraging of research that gets done at universities, both including inputs and involvement from stakeholders and research that is explicitly interdisciplinary, and that's really good, I think.
Well, those are all great points. I think we'll switch to the audience Q&A in a couple of minutes, but before that, maybe a quick fire question for all three of our panelists. And this, if there was one area of research in maybe your discipline, outside your discipline, that you feel is underfunded and that you could fund today, what is that? What would that research project be?
I'll be quick. Exactly what Jordan just said. But okay. We need more movement in that direction, but we need much more community-driven co-developed science.
I mean, what comes to mind is I've always wanted to expand work I do to other regions of the world globally, so it's easy to get. It's much easier to focus on the US or certain areas of the world. I think there are a lot of interesting questions that I would like to explore outside those locations, which are not impossible, but they're harder to get kind of resources to look at. So that would be great.
Nice.
Yeah, I definitely second what Fernando just said. But it's my own answer. Like within the US, the thing that remains like a total black box to me is the natural gas industry. And it is very vulnerable to weather and also integrally related to the power grid. And there's way, way, way less public information about how that industry works relative to the power sector. So I'm hoping to learn more about it.
It looks like the US is going to be the largest, or is the largest exporter of LNG, right? This year.
You could be right.
Yeah, I think I read that. Awesome. Well, thanks to all our panelists, but let's open up to the audience Q&A. Feel free to grill our panelists, ask tough questions. We're here for all of that.
And really quickly, anybody in the audience right now, if you wanted to ask a question, all the microphones do work. All you have to do is press the button for the mic on and off. You can go ahead and talk.
And for our Zoom attendees, you can drop the questions in the chat box. You can send it across to everyone so everyone can see your question and I can read them out loud. Go for it. If you can state your name and maybe your department, that'll be nice.
Hello, my name is Jada West, and I'm an environmental science major, College of Natural Resources. And I've enjoyed hearing from each of you. So I noticed that all of you are like in like different sections of like climate science and environmental science. So I was wondering, like during your undergrad, like did you know what area of climate change you guys wanted to go into? And if not, like what experiences you guys had that kind of like shaped that, you know?
I guess we're going in order. I touched on that in my opening. So I know whether or not truly that's what I want to do. And I went to college for meteorology for my undergrad. And I did an internship at the National Weather Service in Albany, New York. And I realized I'm a terrible forecaster and I didn't like it. So, oh no, what am I going to do? You know, should I think about research? And I took a job with New York State working on a number of things, which ended up being climate adaptation. But I saw a talk, and I'm going to date myself. This was the mid-2000s, and it was on climate change impacts in New York. And I thought, this is what I need to be working on. This is really solvable. Here we are, almost 20 years later. And I ended up moving my graduate studies in that direction.
And I can describe it quickly. Before getting into anything climate, I studied air pollution, specifically as an air quality scientist. And really what led me there was not really an interest in air quality so much as an interest in high performance computing and computational methods. So air quality models, pretty sophisticated computational tools and everything, and I really like working with computers. So that led me there, and then I was working with regional scale air quality models on just more present day challenges, and always intrigued by the scary climate models. That scale of the competition. So immediately after kind of my PhD, I wanted to look at climate, learn more about those methods, and fortunately the results. Really interesting connections between atmospheric chemistry and air quality and climate. So that led me. For me, it's been more the interest on the computational side of things, at least initially.
Yeah, for me, I was an environmental science undergraduate, not here, but at another big state university in North Carolina. And I think I graduated and didn't know what I wanted to do. It was the undergraduate degree was very ecology focused, which I wasn't a huge fan of. I didn't like field work, didn't really like lab work. I gravitated towards computational work. So when I went to grad school, I thought engineering, and I tried it, and I just had a great advisor and a great first project that wasn't related to power grid at all. It was like more traditional sort of water resource engineering, but had to do with how this hydroelectric dam was being operated. The owners was the Army Corps of Engineers. They were being threatened with litigation by the Nature Conservancy about how the dam was being operated. And we did some digging, and it turned out that the way they were operating this dam had to do with them releasing water at just the right time to make the most money selling electricity, and it all had to do with this big thing called the electricity market. And I didn't know what it was, and the more I learned, I was kind of fascinated. So that's the direction I went from there. And then, you know, became kind of obsessed with the grid and modeling the grid.
Any other questions? Oh. Do you have one more question? Okay.
I actually have a question. So after hearing all you guys' wonderful presentation, we're very impressed. Thank you again for coming. I think it's definitely clear to see that as we get into kind of a decade and as we've kind of gone on in the last couple of years or so, things are definitely starting to ramp up. We're definitely starting to see a lot more of climate change at a rapid rate. And the time's kind of running out to really do something about it. So as a member of the general public, as a member of the undergraduate community in NC State, and kind of looking at climate change from both a political and economic standpoint, what are ways the general public can get involved? What are policies we should be looking to brush up on? And what are investments we can seek to kind of be a part of to not only help the nation kind of move towards the right direction, but help ourselves be more informed?
That's a great question. So last Monday, we heard that we're careening toward an unlivable planet, and corporations and countries haven't lived up to their promises. And that was overshadowed by Will Smith slapping somebody at the Oscars, which is just frightening that message was completely lost by that. But yeah, we are running out of time, but we still have time. The best things that the general public can do: vote, obviously, a climate-informed electorate is, you know, what we need, but also organizing, getting involved in communities. We think about the top line elections a lot, but it's often local planning boards, city councils who control a lot of the things that are actually smart climate policy, transportation policy and housing policy, and health policy. And then talking about it. So I talk about climate change all the time because that's my job, but research shows that most people don't talk about climate change. And like I said, with the extension example, I can walk into your house and talk with your family about climate change, but they're gonna listen to you more, hopefully, and trust you more. So talking with friends and neighbors about your concerns, but also your hopes for a better planet.
I agree with all that too. The question was like, what can undergrads do?
Undergrads, general public.
I guess I'll make one comment from the perspective of undergrads. I am by nature somewhat pessimistic. And so I think that's a tough spot to be in, like being 18 to 22 and having people say your planet's going to be unlivable. And it doesn't really give you, I mean, you know, this is happening for decades, right? And there are a lot of reasons why nothing's happened. They're frustrating. And some of those reasons still exist, right? And so we go on and on about how difficult, like how it's solvable, but it's also really difficult and complicated to solve. So I think there also has to be some space for acceptance in a way, like talking about climate change in a way that like doesn't freak out people. And I don't think I have arrived at how to do that, but I do think that there's got to be some way to talk about it. And, well, Ezra Klein does a really good job of this, where, you know, he'll say like, it's not binary, right? You don't like solve it or don't solve it. Like a lot of climate change is worse than a little bit of climate change. It's more of a spectrum. And I think approaching it that way, where you push and push and push, but realize kind of what you're pushing against as well, where it might not just be misinformation, right? About why people don't support paying a lot of money to solve climate change, that the benefits of that action may not directly impact them, right? A lot of people, politicians, have a hard time making decisions if there's not a clear investment value associated with that. And that's like a human psychology problem that we've sort of inherited, right? As opposed to a flaw. So anyway, I don't want to rant, but I do think that's something that I noticed in young people, is that it's teaching this type of stuff that can be pretty depressing pretty quickly. And I think, I don't know, not to tread lightly, but like find a way to like bring people in and also teach them how to live in a world in which climate will probably like just like impact their lives significantly. Also like trying to capture.
Just to pick up on the last point Jordan said, because we have a question in the chat from Chianlo, and she asks, in the background of climate change and decarbonization, is there any suggestion on what we should pay attention to ensure climate justice, energy justice, and environmental justice? And just to quickly add, because I know both Fernando and Kathie have done some work on this, and Kathie, you've worked with the knowledge of indigenous people with respect to climate change. If you can speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, we don't have climate resilience or climate action without climate justice. And I think the climate science community came a long way it's been way too late for the climate science community to pick up on this. It's not novel. Justice organizations have been working in communities for decades on climate work. So what I'm doing is silly in comparison, honestly, but yeah, I think we need to center the voices of those who are most affected. And I would say knowing when to pass the mic, knowing when to elevate voices. And I think recognizing that sometimes these marginalized communities are next to really affluent communities who are actually exacerbating the climate risks downstream. So, and being a good steward of your whole community, your whole area, and partnering with those to help lift voices.
Yeah, I could just add to that. There's, of course, have a renewed interest or an increase in interest on these topics, but it's nothing new. And it's sad to see. It's exciting to see that on one side. It's sad to see that it hasn't been as big of a part of the conversation in prior instances often. So there are, of course, both in climate impacts and air quality impacts, for stuff we do, disparities and environmental injustice issues associated with those impacts. What we often see is that even if you mitigate and even if you do things to decrease those impacts, those disparities persist even beyond solutions or mitigation efforts. So that's been known. I think your comment kind of reminds me of a speaker we recently had who is an expert in environmental justice. We have to change the narrative. If you actually focus on environmental justice, that means it tends to lead to a better outcome or the overall problem. By changing that narrative and saying, ensure environmental justice and do that across kind of all complete population and all groups, then you often end up with a better solution to the overall environmental problem. So to me, that was very insightful. To shoot for that as the main target often works for the problem itself.
Awesome. I don't think we have any more questions, but I just want to end with if all three of you could maybe tell us resources that we could use to read and keep up to date with climate science, like stuff you read week by week, or
I've been a part of so many climate assessments, including analysis, national climate assessment, and you can read the 2-pagers on that. I like a podcast by Amy Westervelt called Real Hot Take. That's a great source. There's a lot of great climate journalism popping up. The Washington Post is hiring 50 people to work on climate journalism. So honestly, I point people toward those sorts of things. But yeah, I also hope I wasn't too doomer earlier. This is still certainly a planet worth living on.
I'll just quickly say, I think there is so many resources that it's hard for me to keep track of them. So I tend to narrow it down to a few scientists and a few writers and a few people a few places that I really like to read and I think are insightful. And so maybe keeping track of those keeps me engaged, and then getting exposure to a little more exposure to everything else is also helpful. But at least all the stuff people can do, which I know and I found insightful and also fun to.
Yeah, when you get past the toxicity up on Twitter to be a good resource as well to connect with scientists. Oh, Jordan, how about you?
Yeah, I read people on Twitter. I'm going to join Kath's Twitter. What else? John Oliver.
Nice.
The only other thing I was going to say is, from an energy perspective, the USBIA, the Energy Information Administration, which is currently or will very shortly be headed by our very
he started this week.
He started this week.
Yeah.
Confirmed by the Senate. Is a fantastic resource. It doesn't always connect the dots for you, but they have been increasingly doing a better job of writing these sort of short articles that give you a summary of like, here's what happened, like last month, next year, or last year. And they're just the data brokers for anything energy related. It's really amazing to the degree to which energy data is open and accessible in the United States. So I would encourage you to take a look at that.
Awesome. Well, we wrapped up on time. Let's have a round of applause for all three of our panelists. And if I could invite Emily Flores, we have a token of gratitude that we'd like to hand over. She's the president of the Student Energy Club. You get coveted Student Energy Club mugs.
Cool.
I know that's what all three of you are here for.
This is great. During the pandemic, I just did Zoom talks, so all my mugs are already staged, so now I can represent my employer.
And thank you to our virtual Zoom attendees. Stay tuned for our next event. We have a panel tomorrow on negative bioeconomy by Dr.